How's it going, everybody? So I wanted to kind of address an issue that comes up often when people are trying to figure out the path toward liberty. What happens when you start removing the state's influence on things? And I think one of the toughest ones to address for people, that is to address in a well-articulated way and give some examples about, is the issue of national defense, because people are so used to thinking about the governments of the world constantly doing clandestine operations, using secret forces, having extremely powerful weaponry, and playing this kind of international, full-scale, kind of like a Cold War, but on of course, in a global scale. Um, and I think that for me, I think the natural answer that comes to my mind, and this of course comes from my framework of the not-for-profit government model. If you hadn't heard that before, my model for transition liberty is just turning the government into a not-for-profit. And simply put, that means that the government no longer um, is able to forcibly take money and property from people, as far as taxation is concerned. Just like any other not-for-profit agency, they have to receive all funding voluntarily. But within that model of trying to move toward true liberty, I see the defense issue. If somebody says, hey, well, what happens if the United States becomes, voluntarist, overnight, or taxation goes away? I say that the way to help transition is to do two things. One, have 100% transparency as to what the government has. So, in this transition period of moving toward true liberty, releasing all known information about the United States government's secret operations, as well as all governments across the entire world. So, of course, yeah, it's going to rustle feathers. People might die in the process because of secrets being released, especially when it comes to, Black Ops, CIA stuff. But that's the only way to move forward and understand the true nature of the threats. In order for the market to work, you have to increase the openness of knowledge. And when groups are, through mandatory automatic violence, are suppressing knowledge, especially when it comes to those national secrets, national security, and technology, well, that's going to be very hard for people to work and understand about how they need to move forward in the future. And then as far as the weaponry goes, I see it as, in the short term, acting like a not-for-profit, slash kind of trust, as far as the weaponry goes in national security. I think that the government would have to act as a not-for-profit in that way, making all findings open to the public and providing that kind of, walk tall and carry a big stick kind of defense. The idea that is that the government still has the weaponry as things are starting to be decentralized, and all threats are, being put out there and being made known, based on what the government's, national defense systems and teams are doing. Now, as time progresses, and let's just say the not-for-profit progression is continued, I think it's quite possible that parts of those defenses can become decentralized into some form of I want to look at it from like a kind of shared trust or shared corporation, where individuals of a certain region have a shared investment in that corporation in the forms of actual issued shares, a type of a voting block. And you might say, well, isn't that just like, voting of the past? Isn't that turning into like another type of governance or government? No, because it's just about the knowledge of the weapons and the ownership interest in those things. So for example, if I were to take this into a very concrete way, imagine that state of New York, right? State of New York has national defense weaponry located there. The people who live in the New York area originally are issued a certain ownership based on just their individuality in this sort of trust, and a type of, partial ownership in terms of like a shareholder, as you'd imagine, on a 100% individual basis. And from there on out, things continue to work according to market forces. And some people might be like, oh, it's kind of scary, because then what happens? Like, does some rich, super rich billionaire like start to go and buy up all the shares and start threatening people with violence? And I think what you'll probably find is that more likely than not, based on the study of human action, people don't actually really want to be blown up in that way. And so I think that you'll find, um, maybe you'll get a smaller group of people who actually end up, deciding to have a controlling kind of interest within it, creating some sort of like shared governance within it. Um, but I don't think that you'll find this kind of uh, I guess you could say apocalyptic ending where it's like, oh my gosh, now most everybody sold their shares to this one guy, and now he's using that controlling ownership interest to like blow things up. I think it ends up being a form of like competing not-for-profits that are trying to provide security. And I think that eventually there might be over time a certain type of sales as relates to security agencies. I think that it's quite possible that down the road you might find that competing major security agencies that provide certain types of protection end up trying to get a bigger controlling interest in that to make sure that those systems of surveillance, as far as what was national defense was in the past, um, uh, become much more secure and stable. And I think that's really the only way to, in the long term, begin to decentralize that, um, because otherwise there's going to be the issues of I guess you could say people going to buying these extremely dangerous government weapons, and then again trying to create their own governments right thereafter by threatening other people with it. I think that you're going to have um, a lot of trouble if you don't decentralize it at the individual level, just because what's really happening there. And again, this has to be understood as from what was the past moving to the future. Okay, you went from monopolization. And if you go from monopolization and suddenly throw in a new monopolization, you're going to have a new power problem. It has to be a decentralization, and that goes with all the assets of government. Eventually, there has to be a decentralization. All the weapons and properties and all these things that once were held under a federal or a state kind of trust, starting to move away from that. And that goes for anything else. I mean, potentially might be in the future that I think roads, as they stand, might be in that similar form. As I'm talking about for National Defense Trust, there might become shareholder-style trusts in maybe regional road ownerships that begin to happen where people might earn dividends on those use of roads and eventually be able to share ownership, sell ownership in those road stocks and so on and so forth as things begin to become decentralized. Again, this is not the end-all be-all. What I'm trying to present is a possible way to decentralize the power of the federal government, marketize those interests, and help people have an actual controlling monetary that is pecuniary interest in the goods and services that before they had no choice in, right? We're increasing choice as we decentralize, begin to spread out the power that once was all collected wholly within the seat, technically of the executive as far as those launch codes are concerned, at least in the surface, right? So, that's how I think I approach any of these kinds of situations. I look at it from like a very realistic long-term perspective in saying that realistically there's a lot of centralization, there's a lot of property, there's a lot of past harm, and that takes time in order to amend and decentralize from what is, hundreds of years of centralization. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, and the market forces are not going to technically right off the face fix that right away, because again all of those things were taken unlawfully. The government is not a singular actor now that, having stolen or taken from a bunch of people, can now suddenly still act within true free market forces of its non-existence, right? The virtue of government selling off something, the government says, hey, here's all of our nuclear weaponry for 2 cents, and they give it to one person, and of course it's some person that wants to reestablish government, right? That kind of choice would not be a very realistic, true pricing mechanism, within markets for competing interests, right? It's a centralization of power, and so the idea there is how do you take the government and start to realistically decentralize those parts. And I think that's how you have to kind of move forward, is by bringing in a money aspect, turning things into shares, turning things into potential profits for people to make money back on, and then eventually, as you're working through, rectifying past harms that are, that can be shown proximity to government actors doing things potentially, maybe with Native Americans, or certain other people that were specifically and directly harmed by the existing, federal government, and then starting to sell off the stuff that wasn't actually necessary, that people aren't regularly using, getting rid of the education, all these other, departments with land management. Not that still isn't going to be an issue, but rather selling off those services, opening up that communication as to what was going on beforehand, so that now when it's not so secret, market actors can say, okay, this is what they knew, this is what they've learned, what are the needs and wants are going to come as this transition happens. So it's, it's a big stretch of the imagination to think about it like that, but I think it's something you should definitely consider in how you speak to people about it, because a lot of times you're like, well, what's going to happen with this or that, national defense. There's a million different ways that the issue arises with liberty and nations and defense, but you have to think, okay, well, what's a realistic bridge the gap? As far as getting people on board and helping them to think about, okay, how do we go to more liberty from here when there's nation states everywhere? And again, it's always, how do we move away the ultimate power of governments, taxation? Well, boom. It doesn't, if you say you can't tax anymore, okay, that doesn't mean that the governments don't exist as far as they're actors. It just means that now we've moved away the parts that are theft, and market influences begin to come in, because now people want to support, again, they have to do so voluntarily, otherwise they go outside the government system, right? Postal service, and people suddenly say, hey, you don't have the monopoly anymore, and there's a better service offering, mail being sent, letters and packages, just like in China. They don't have a monopoly on the mail service, and their mail service kind of stinks and is slow and sucks because everybody else uses the private market. That's exactly what has to happen with the government powers, is you start to lose that monopoly, especially as to taxation, and things then can start moving along with market signals. But again, the government can't just simply take all the stuff that they've accumulated through theft and then just be like, oh, I'm going to pass this off, or they're going to start, picking and choosing, again, winners and losers. They have to start decentralizing. They have to take away the core part and start letting the market functions begin to fix and rectify some of those past harms, while instilling power back into the people, redistributing, which takes time to do so in a way that is ethical. And of course, there's not going to be a perfect ethical outcome, because not all people who have been harmed will be able to be have their harms rectified. But to the best extent possible, as far as tracing specific harms, to the best extent possible, as far as curtailing current harms and taking away and stopping current thefts, and moving the incentives back into the people's hands as far as revenue is concerned, that's very important. That's extremely important as far as those goods and services go, because again, the government has effective possession of things that are market valuable. People wish they had access to a road to say, hey, we could charge people for using this, or charge for advertising along the roads. People wish they had that kind of ability for market incentives, but that will come when people actually have the receiving end of those benefits, and no longer it's monopolized with bureaucrats and politicians as far as those powers go. All right, thanks everyone. Talk to you later.